Welcome to the Recover You podcast. I'm Kylene.
And I'm Patrick.
We are a couple in recovery
from sex addiction
and betrayal trauma. Together, we share our story to encourage you on your journey. It's here that we talk about sex addiction, betrayal trauma, mental, emotional, and physical health, faith, and anything and everything needed to recover you to your most authentic self that God created you to be.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. I am Pat Terhune, and I am going to be doing a solo episode today. Kylene has a good dear friend that has come into town, and she's hanging out with. And she looked at me yesterday afternoon and said, "We have to record one tonight." I was like, "No, not tonight. I'll do it by myself." So, and then she's been kind of saying, "Hey, what are you going to talk about?" I'm like, "Well, you're just going to have to trust me." So she has nothing to worry about. These are going to be some good things I'm talking about today. So it's fun to do a solo episode. It's always fun to have to be able to do it together, but it's also fun to talk through a couple things that I think are pretty important. So today, what I'm going to be talking about is a couple things that it's important for the addict to remember when they're responding to or reacting to or working towards a relationship recovery with their betrayed spouse. You know, we've talked about this before, but the path of recovery between the two individuals, the addict and the betrayed partner, does vary over time. And so sometimes what we are looking for is the ability to microwave our relationship to repaired. We're looking for the ability to microwave our own spouse's recovery work and get it done in 30 days or get it done in 90 days. But, you know, just unfortunately, it just doesn't work that way. It'd be great if it did. It'd be great if you could put somebody in a biofeedback chamber and, spend 30 minutes in there and snap your fingers and everybody's healed. Unfortunately, it takes much, much longer than that. And also through that process is actually the process where you grow. You actually grow and your partner grows, and then in turn you have this special opportunity for your relationship to grow and to grow deeper. But it's not a short process, and I wanted to go over just a couple things today that are important to remember if you're the recovering addict in the relationship. I think it's as you work through it, just important things to remember. And it's not always easy because you're dealing with your own hurts and traumas and your own patterns, and one of the things that's important to remember is it takes time to establish new patterns. I mean, think about for those of us who have raised kids, we watch our kids grow, and they change through the years, and by the time they're 17 or 18 and they're ready to move out of the house, they've gone through a whole lot of shaping and a whole lot of learning. And it doesn't happen in 30 days. And then they go off to college, let's say, or a trade school, or they enter the workforce, and we see growth and development and progress. But once again, it doesn't happen in 30 days or 60 days. It happens over time. I think about, our son just finished his third year at college, and this last year we really saw a lot of growth out of him. But it took a year, and it was compounded by it was that growth was a compound development of the growth that had happened in the first 2 years. So as he's entering his final year and he's turned 21, he's a far much different human being, man, than he was when he went at the age of 18. So, recovery is no different than that. And you got to understand that in a lot of cases, our spouses are reeling, and they spend a lot of time early on in the recovery process trying to make sense of this. It doesn't make sense. One of the important things to remember is, we lived in this world. We know, you could argue the terminology. We know what happens when you do a search. We know what interactions are like. Like if you've had an affair, you know exactly what all that is. But your betrayed partner doesn't know. So they fill in the gaps, and because of our own, let's say, denial and unwillingness to talk about it, maybe we're not as forthcoming as we could be. So there's a lot of just uncertainty and gaps and shock, and the information is just really incredibly hurtful. The patterns are hurtful, and even if, like in our case, it was a complete disclosure, and it was a complete blind side for Kylene. So the world that she knew existed did not exist. And I remember hearing that and saying, well, how can you say that? Like, I still love you, and I still want to care for you, and I still want to be with you. But it took me a little while to kind of understand what that was like. And that was part of my healing too, was to develop that greater empathy and understanding of what exactly she was going through. Now, if you're in a different type of situation where, let's say, the betrayed spouse has known about your behavior but continues to be, let's say, traumatized by you as you continue to act out, well, that's just a whole sense of being unsafe. And that person has existed in an unsafe environment for a long, long time. And so it's going to take some time to just, turn that around. So I wanted to go through, 3 things that I wanted to highlight for people as they're going through this process. And the first one is, and I just talked about this a little bit, but it takes a long time. It really does take a long time. I remember on the first group meeting that I went to, and the message was, it takes 3 to 5 years. And I remember thinking, oh my gosh, 3 to 5 years. Holy crap. I'm 49 right now. That means, 52, sorry, I'm going to do math here, 52 to 54 years old. Oh my gosh, like my life is over. Like my life is over. I've really blown this, and everything. But looking back, now I'm at 4 years and 4 months. That time frame has been beautiful. It has, at each moment through this time, it has created learnings in me. Kylene and I have connected in many, many different ways. My ability to interact with the world has changed. I'm a leader in my job, and so my ability to show up and demonstrate empathy has grown and developed through through everything. But if you think about, if that's how long it's taken for me to grow, Kylene, it's taken her time. It takes a long time. It depends on a lot of factors, and there's no way that I could humanly list all of those factors on why it would take a betrayed spouse, a long time to heal. But, I think, a couple things that I wrote down were, their healing level coming into the betrayal. Let's say they have had multiple traumas and that they were dealing with, and that was certainly Kylene's case. She had multiple traumas and multiple traumatic things that she had been through, and this, really uncovered all of that. Let's say you had a really great, safe upbringing, and your ability to process through it could be a little bit easier to do, but it just does do that. The level of betrayal could impact it. We've talked about this before, that a lot of folks will have a series of, let's say, non-negotiables. So somebody may say, hey, I can work through the fact that you looked at pornography, but I couldn't manage a physical affair, or I couldn't manage an emotional affair. So, depending on what your level of acting out was, or your level of sexual acting out, it could really impact that partner's ability to trust. And so I've heard things where people have had to let's say leave friend groups because the addicted spouse had fantasized about somebody in the friend group or something like that. And so sometimes there's jobs that have to be left and things like that, because let's say there was an affair in the workplace. You try to stay in the workplace, that could just prolong that healing. So it just there's a couple things there that it would impact. I think and you could even overlay like the pattern of abuse. It could take the partner a long time to recover if you have, let's say, verbally abused them for a long time, or let's say you emotionally abused them. And Kylene and I have talked about this before. My behavior was a form of emotional abuse. I manipulated her, and I did it for a long time. So therefore, if I had manipulated her from 2011 when we met until 2021 when I was discovered, that's 10 years. She's not just going to get over that in 30 to 60 to 90 days. She needs to see a pattern of behavior, and she also needs to understand and work through her own traumas. Sometimes we want recognition, and we are so, and many of us are so happy that we're no longer engaged in the behavior. And I remember feeling this way. I was so ecstatic that it was no longer a part of my life. And at that 30-day mark, and that 60-day mark, and the 90-day mark, and I was starting to see the days tick by, and I was so excited. I was just like, man, I can't believe, something that I thought I would never be able to shake has now left me, and I'm starting to get these small victories, and I'd be really excited. And I remember coming in, and there were times when Kylene celebrated with me, and there were times she didn't, and so as she said, I'm not gonna celebrate the fact that you've gone 90 days without cheating on me. And I remember the first time she said something like that, I was like, oh yeah, no, she's right. She's right. I wish I could have delivered to her a faithful marriage, and I was unable to do so. So it was going to take some time. And, occasionally there's there's a notion, I don't know if the betrayed spouse will think this is like, hey, if you were unfaithful to me for 11 years, it's going to take 11 years. Now, I don't believe it takes 11 years, but the point being is it takes a long time. It takes it, and they sometimes, people have to set the right expectations. So if you're a recovering addict and you're working on relationship recovery, one of the best things you can do is set that expectation in your head that, hey, this is going to take a long time. This is not going to be something. And occasionally, you may get frustrated because maybe you feel like it's not going as fast as you want. And those human emotions are okay. But what I highly, highly recommend is you bring those feelings to the group. That's where the work with your accountability partner, that's when it's okay to kind of bring up in a group and say, hey, I'm not sure if my wife is healing, or, hey guys, I've had guys come in and say, hey guys, I hit 90 days, and we celebrate them, right? And that we are going to celebrate folks in the group because we've all been there, but it may be a different celebration than what you receive from your spouse. So it's just a long-term motivation that or long-term pattern, or a long-term struggle that you have to continue to set that expectation in your mind. One of the things I was thinking about is there's this whole notion of external motivation versus intrinsic motivation. Intrinsic motivation is you don't necessarily need a reward. You do these things because they're the things to do. And so when you decide, either via discovery or because you've just had enough or whatever that is, that you're going to live a different life, one of the great mindsets to develop is a mindset of intrinsic motivation. And that's just internal motivation. You're not looking for external reward, and you're just moving forward. Now, that's, once again, it's not like getting over addiction where you just snap your fingers and get there, but it's a good thing to explore maybe with your therapist or in your groups. And you say, hey, what does it take for me to develop intrinsic motivation, or what blocks are going on in my life that prevents me from developing an intrinsic motivation attitude. So once again, it's okay to want some recognition for the work you're doing, but just don't be surprised, or don't be taken aback if your spouse doesn't give that to you. Seek that from elsewhere. There's plenty of folks in your life as you're moving through an addiction recovery program that will that will be able to pat you on the back, but just don't expect that from your spouse right away. My wife actually says it this way: is so after or a long pattern of abuse, or after betrayal, or whatever that may be, is she's in the negative in her feelings towards you. Maybe over time she gets to neutral, And then maybe over a lot more time, she gets to positive. So she's not going to go from negative to positive in a very quick fashion. So that's always a key thing to remember. Second thing I wanted to talk about is consistency is key. And a lot of these are intertwined, right? It takes a long time. Well, why does it take a long time? Because you have to demonstrate consistency. So if you demonstrate consistency over the long haul, well, then you start to bring safety to the situation. So, I always think about this as we have this little cat, and this cat has been in our lives since 2019, and she's a great cat, and she's really loving. But when we first got her, she had been returned to the shelter several times. So, this cat was traumatized, and it hid. And over time, because we loved on it and we created a safe environment, and we pet it and we worked on its food, and Kylene's just done an amazing, she's got an incredible patience with the cat when it comes to food and working with the cat to get the cat what it needs. But we've, now it's 6 years in, and this cat is, I took a picture of the cat basically sleeping around Kylene's head this past week. So this cat has really grown in its safety, but it didn't happen in 10 days. It took a long time. It took an absolute long time for that cat to learn that, no, you're now in a safe environment. So think of how you would approach an animal. And of course, your betrayed spouse is not an animal. That's not what I'm saying. But think about the impact on the nervous system of your spouse. What betrayal and what long-term abuse has done to your spouse. That it has really upended their nervous system. So it's going to take a long time for an animal to feel, your betrayed spouse to feel more safe. It's going to just take consistency and over time. A couple ways that you can show up consistently, and I've always recommend the book Help or Heal. But a couple ways that you can do that is by demonstrating empathy, demonstrating some understanding. One of the best things to do is to repeat back. So if your spouse says, I feel like you just ripped my heart out, and you almost in a way kind of repeat that back to her. So it feels like my behavior just destroyed your heart. You know what I mean? Like when they hear that you can demonstrate to them exactly how they're feeling, and that is a genuine communication, that actually will start to show your spouse that you are seeking greater understanding. Because when you seek greater understanding and you really come to understand the impact of the behavior you've done, it's going to be a gift to you, because then you can show up and support that spouse. And it also gives you extra motivation to keep working on your own recovery. I think at the end of the day, we all want to get to the point where we're not doing this behavior anymore. That's really what our overall goal is, and we show up and we live a life of integrity. One of the, they talk about active listening. How can you become consistent in the messages that you are sending? And, I always want to say that, we're human beings. We're not always going to get this right. Sometimes, and this has happened between Kylene and me, but, there's been times when maybe you went and had a couple drinks with a friend, and maybe a year or two in, and you come home and she's upset and you're on a big high, and she kind of hits you with something, and you weren't really expecting it, and maybe you don't react the best way. But it also gives you the opportunity to repair. Relationships rupture. Every relationship is going to rupture in some small or large way. It's how you repair those relationships. So what we're doing is we're learning more about repairing a relationship. So, I think consistency, it takes a long time, and then consistency over the long haul. How do you continue to show up? How do you continue to demonstrate empathy towards your spouse? Do you show up with defensiveness, or do you show up in a calm way? Do you show up with the ability to withstand, let's say, withering criticism, which sometimes in an activated space, your spouse may come at you with. She may come at you and say, "Hey, I feel like you didn't love me. I feel like all you did was enjoy this. I feel like you don't know what love is." And you may, in your mind, say, "Well, I think I do know what love is, but I understand where you're coming from," versus, "Nope, you're wrong. I know what love is. And yes, I always love you, and you're wrong." it's, their feelings in that moment are very, very valid, and your ability to validate those feelings and understand is going to allow you to continue to show up consistently. The third one I have is proactivity, and once again, all of these are intermixed. But being in a situation where the spouse does not have to push you to go to group. Hey, it's Monday night. Are you going to group? Nah, I'm tired. Okay. So right away now that message that goes to your spouse is, hey, when I'm tired, I'm not willing to do the hard things. Or, I'm not going to prioritize you high enough to be able to, go to group. So versus, do you engage in going to group? You tell her, hey, we need to work our schedule around. I'll get a babysitter. I'll do whatever, but I have to go to group. And so I remember when I started going to groups, because I'd never been to a group. And then, of course, once I started running groups, there were a couple nights where I was like, man, I'm tired. And I would really love to just stay home. And there were a couple times even Kylene was like, man, I wish you didn't have to go to group tonight. We could hang out. And I remember I was like, yeah, but this is what I got to do. And especially once I started running groups, because guys were dependent on my ability to essentially show up, unlock the door, and and run the video and generate the discussions. Those are all really, really important things. So voluntarily going to group, doing your group activity. A lot of these groups have group activities. 12-step has the 12 steps, and sometimes there are, some reasons that could come from your family of origin as to why you find it hard to do the work. But just keep in mind, and those reasons may be, things that you have to work through, but, your spouse is really looking at you to say, hey, am I worth it? Am I worth it? I know what's happened. And I think a lot of times spouses will go, and I understand the addictive component, but in light of all that we didn't know, now that we know things, how engaged, how proactive, how motivated is this person in driving healing and providing safety for me? So, number one, it takes a long, long time. It takes a long time to get through this. And if you're consistent over that long haul, you're going to start to grow that safety, and then being proactive within that. If you finish a 10-week program, do you say, nah, I'm done? But if you say you're done, well, 10 weeks is not a long time, right? So, 3 to 5 years of active recovery work could mean many, many different things, but it means that you're engaged in recovery. And it means that you're engaged, maybe it's a Saturday morning group with some guys where you meet and you do a check-in and you read through a book or whatever. Maybe it's therapy and you continue to work through some things. Maybe it's you develop a check-in with your spouse to continue to find ways to move forward through your healing. So, I think it's just our spouses want to see that this matters, that this whole process matters. And I know Kylene used to say this. She's like, you were so motivated in your addiction, and I understand that comment, right? Because when you look at the level of activity and the frequency of activity, it could relate itself to motivation, right? And so what she was looking for was the same level of activity and motivation towards recovery, towards her. She wanted to see me direct my energies and all of my learning in a direction that would not only heal me, but help us provide safety in the house. I mentioned this before, is one of the most effective mindsets that I think I was able to adopt. And I don't know how I adopted this, to be quite honest with you. And I don't want to be like, I had this grand vision when I started, but it worked out. And that was, I'm going to heal no matter what happens between Kylene and I. And so I think my and I don't know if it was just a blip that happened or whatever, but just an intrinsic motivation that came in and said that I want to do this because I no longer want to have this be part of my behavior, because I realize how destructive it had been. Because of my own wounding and my own negative self-beliefs, I thought it was better that Kylene move on. But I wasn't basing our relationship recovery and success, it wasn't tied, my ability to continue through the healing process was not tied to our relationship status. I think that's probably a better way to say it. So I didn't, I very well thought that I would come home one day and she'd be like, I'm out. And so, she showed me through her love and grace and toughness that that's not where she was. Once again, she saw something in me that I didn't see in me, and her ability to kind of carry me through that was really important. So, yeah, I just think, we just have to remember that when we've hurt somebody and we've hurt them deeply, they're not going to get over it right away. It's going to take them time. And, sometimes if you think about the people who have hurt you, how long have we held grudges, right? If you think about it that way, like, did you get in a fight in elementary school and you held a grudge against that kid until your 20-year reunion? You know what I mean? Like think about things that way. Like we have a tendency to hold grudges, and we hold political grudges and we hold workplace grudges. If a boss doesn't give you a promotion, how long do you hang on to that? So and those are all, sometimes those can be very, very unhealthy. But just think about it. And so put yourself in your wife's shoes or in your spouse's shoes. It's a really important thing. How would you react? I was cheated on in previous relationships, and I knew pornography and what I was doing was infidelity. It was different because it wasn't physical, as far as I was concerned. But I remember hearing Kylene early on, talk about what it meant and like what message it sent her and all of that, and it reminded me of how I felt. And then of course I ended up feeling bad because I was like, man, if I knew how that felt, how could I do that to her? And that that took me a long time to work through that, but that was part of that long-term process for me to take that empathy and be able to turn it into further action and further ability to show up and be there for her over time. So, the 4 years were, every day in the 4 years was at times long. But I can say, looking back on the 4 years, it's felt short, like we've gotten through it. And it's just, where we're at today, it's just a real blessing. And I think, as I look back on my own experience, I think those three things, I didn't always get it right. There were times where I wish that we were through things. I really, really did. So I want to make sure that as I'm talking about this process, I'm not sitting here saying that I was this Zen master that knew that at the 5-year mark that I was going to be good. There were times I was impatient. There was times that I was frustrated that she wanted to bring something up again, and triggers show up when you least expect them, right? So Kylene might have I would have had like a wonderful day hanging out or whatever, and then boom, a trigger hit, and I would get at times it would catch me off guard, and I would get frustrated, and I would have to apologize, and I would have to say, hey, I'm sorry, you're right, and those sorts of things. And so it's just, there were times I was tired and didn't want to go to therapy. There was times I didn't want to work on things. There was times when, at times, I do these evening groups, and, I travel for business, and there's times I don't want to get on the Zoom. And so, all these things are they're part of it. I mean, it's just part of the human experience, but you apologize, you get right back on the horse, and you say, hey, let's keep going. So, I think I want to approach, those of you who are recovering in this way and you're early on with a lot of grace and a lot of love and a lot of sympathy, because I know how hard it is. But, maybe you can write these things down, that, put them on your mirror. It takes a long time. Consistency is key, and proactivity is key. And sometimes those messages, they say you're 70% more likely to do something when you write it down, but maybe if you could take the time to write it down and put something out there that helps you move forward. So that's my solo episode for today, and I hope everybody is having a great day. And I'm thankful that I'm able to now that you talk about the 4 years, it's, 4 years, 4 months. I have a restored relationship. I'm able to speak on this podcast, and then I can get off the podcast and go upstairs and kiss my wife. So it wasn't something that I could do every day, and it's something that took a long time. But once again, just consistency is key. It takes a long time, and proactivity is a key. So thanks for listening today. Every day is a new opportunity to choose health and freedom. Make that choice today, and we'll see you next week.
Woohoo! If you're listening to this, it means you've made it through an entire episode. Part of recovery is spending time engaging in healing and self-growth activities. We are thankful that you chose our podcast to be one of those activities today. Make sure you reward yourself for that accomplishment. If you've enjoyed this episode or this podcast, we would love to hear from you. Please take just a few moments to leave a rating and review, letting us know your experience with Recover You. We not only love hearing how these episodes are helpful, but ratings and reviews help others just like you who are searching for recovery information and support find the podcast too. We can't wait to hear from you. See you next week.